introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Stefan Gasner. He leads Grosvenor's procurement and contracting practice and helps our clients transform their procurement function, manage high-stakes procurement projects, and improve their supplier management. Stefan has trained over 300 people in the art of successful contract management. He has a PhD in procurement and is also a lecturer for strategic procurement at the University of Technology in Sydney. So he knows his stuff. So once again, welcome, Stefan. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jade, and welcome everyone to this second part of our 7-part contract management webinar series. Today we'll be talking about how you can actually set up a successful contract straight at the beginning of the sourcing process. So there's a lot of things that you can do right at the beginning that will make your life as a contract manager much easier later on. So we'll look at things that make a successful contract ultimately successful, and we'll also look what you need to look at during the sourcing process, during the procurement process, what needs to be in the contract itself that will make it easier to manage that contract. Next time, and I think that's on the 1st of June, correct me if I'm wrong, Jade, we'll look at how you get started with managing the contract. So that then follows that contract life cycle into how do you start implementing the things around contract management and the contract itself. But today we'll talk about those first couple of steps in the contract life cycle, which are about the procurement of the contract and what you can do right there. All right, so this is a slide that we saw at the end of the last webinar, and there are a couple of steps here that I've just grouped together as that sourcing step. So what contract management entails, today we'll be talking just about that sourcing step, and then in the following webinars we'll talk about all of these other ones, the implementing, the managing, the reviewing, and the deciding on closeout or extension. So today we'll talk about the sourcing part, and here your main responsibility as the contract manager is actually to make sure that there's sufficient subject matter knowledge available to the sourcing project. So typically these steps that we talk about today are actually facilitated by your procurement team, and you would be part of a procurement project, typically a project team. Now the procurement person obviously knows exactly how to best engage the market. So how do you run a tender process? What are the legislative requirements around running a suitable market engagement? Are 3 quotes sufficient, or does it actually have to be an open tender process, and so on? Now that's the domain of the procurement person, whereas on the other hand, your domain as a contract manager typically is the subject matter. So if you are sourcing an IT contract, the procurement person won't be an IT person typically. In big organizations, there might actually be some procurement people that have some sort of IT knowledge and they manage the IT category, but in small organizations, procurement people are typically generalists. So your responsibility then is to make sure that within that project team there is enough subject matter knowledge, so for example IT knowledge, so that the contract actually reflects all of the requirements that you have day to day, and also that it has fit for purpose performance measures, and that it clearly articulates what is the service provider's responsibility and what is your responsibility. So again, this is obviously in your best interest, because when you have a contract later on that you need to manage that doesn't quite reflect what is actually required, what the actual needs of your organization are, well, how can you then have a successful contract? That is a good segue into the next slide. What does a successful contract actually look like? So what is it that we're aiming for? And time and again, we see that contracts are successful if there's a couple of things that overlap. And what are the 3 areas that need to overlap within a contract? Well, the first one is the specifications and the terms and conditions of the contract. So the specifications, it's sometimes called statement of works or scope of works. It basically tells the service provider what needs to be delivered in this contract. And if you can sort of define those in a way that there's no gray areas left and it's quite clear who needs to do what and when, well, that makes the contract ultimately more successful. And if the terms and conditions of the contract, so that's the legal speak, and all of the clauses around, insurance requirements, but then also how to vary the contract, for example, or how the contract could be terminated, how fees are getting paid, and things like that. So those are the things that are typically prepared by a lawyer or a legal person, that are also that also form part of this contract. Now, we see that contracts that are entirely prepared by legal people fall a bit short on the specifications end of things. So specifications in our experience are best when they're actually written by a practitioner and by someone like yourselves who has that subject matter knowledge of what is actually required and what has worked in the past. So there's probably two ways of how some clients that we see fall short on this one. The first one is it's written in a way that is very legal term-like, and then it's also way too long, and it becomes an unmanageable document, and therefore people just don't ever refer to it when managing the contract later on. And the other thing around specifications is you can either have input-based specifications or outcome-based specifications, and we'll highlight that one again at a later slide today of what you can look at there that makes it more manageable later on. The second area in the contract that is very important is the pricing structure. And by pricing structure, I don't necessarily mean the actual cost or the actual price that you pay for that contract. I'm more talking about the structure of that. So let me explain that to you. For example, you could have a times and material payment structure, or you could have an outcomes-based paying structure. So only if a milestone has actually been achieved, you would then pay for those services. Or something in between is a sort of a fixed price for the overall services rendered or for the goods delivered. And you see those two areas, the specifications and the pricing structure, they overlap. And that overlap is quite critical. So you have written the specifications in the way that you want to achieve an objective of this contract and a sort of an outcome that you want to achieve. Now, it's important that the pricing structure overlaps with that. What does that mean? Well, imagine you have written specifications in a way that you want to save money, right? So what your outcome is that you want from the service provider is to decrease the overall cost of this contract. Now, if your pricing structure doesn't tie in with that and you actually have times and material sort of remuneration for the service provider, then you will never have a successful contract, because that actually incentivizes the service provider to do more and to then also get more money from you, right? They want to increase their revenues. Your pricing structure allows them by just billing more hours, and you will actually never achieve what your specifications intended to. On the other hand, if you write specifications that incentivize innovation and your pricing structure is a fixed fee, well, again, you will never have a successful contract, because the pricing structure, the fixed fee, incentivizes the service provider to do the absolute minimum and to minimize their cost accordingly, right? So they can maximize their profits. So times and material or an outcome-based pricing structure would probably be more suitable in that regard if you want to incentivize innovation. The third area that we talk about is performance management. Again, that one needs to tie in with the other two. So performance management is more than just KPIs. It's more than just key performance indicators. It is actually a whole structure, and we'll learn about that structure in a later webinar. It is a structure that needs to tie in with your overall contract goals and objectives. So that's the overlap with the specifications. If you want to incentivize innovation, then your performance management and your KPIs actually need to tie in with that goal. So you want to have KPIs that measure how the service provider went about achieving those innovations and actually giving you something new and different in your service delivery, and not just delivering the specifications as they had been over years, right? So if you have KPIs, they need to be relevant to what you want to achieve. that is as set out in your specifications. We often see KPIs that are the same across all of the contracts, and our clients think that that is great. Well, it's actually not, because they're not relevant to this one contract. They are missing that link between performance management and the specifications. Also, their overlap is not just with the specifications, but also with the terms and conditions. If you have the best KPIs in your contract possible and they tie in with your specifications and what you want to achieve, that's great, but it won't matter unless you also have consequences to those KPIs. So if those KPIs have not been achieved, your contract terms and conditions actually need to have some sort of consequence attached to that underachievement of the KPIs. So that doesn't necessarily need to be a termination of the contract, but it can be things like, and this is now where the overlap to the pricing structure comes into place, such as the fees of the service provider will be contingent upon achieving the KPIs or not achieving the KPIs. So you have a sort of a fee at risk pricing structure in that case. If they do really well, they get, say, 150% of the fee at risk, or if they don't do really well, they probably only get half of the fee at risk. So again, the performance management needs to tie in with your terms and conditions and specifications, as well as with the pricing structure. If there is no consequences to achieving KPIs or not achieving KPIs, then they are just toothless tigers. They're just written on paper, and they actually won't help you drive the behavior of the service provider. So the gold standard in performance management is you have KPIs and critical success factors that ultimately tie in with the objective of the contract and also drive the behavior of the service provider to go into the direction that you need it to go. So successful contract. Sorry, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We've had a question.
Okay.
The question is a key ingredient of a successful contract also a dispute resolution / mediation component, or would this form part of performance management?
Yep. So really good contracts don't assume that everything will be peachy keen all of the time. So they actually do have a clause in there that talks about dispute resolution and how that works. Now, I would always see that as a sort of last resort. The performance management area of the contract would be more about preventing it ever going to a dispute and to that clause. But then again, if it fails, the contract should overlap, or there should be an overlap between performance management and terms and conditions that allow that escalation to that formal dispute resolution process. So that's a really good question. And I think it's the second last webinar that we'll talk about when things don't go that well, what you can actually do. So what are those avenues of dispute resolution, formal dispute resolution and also informal dispute resolution? It's a very good question. Thanks for raising that, and I hope I answered it. So just to round off this slide, a successful contract is actually one where all of these three things overlap and are appropriately addressed in the contract and in how it is managed. All right, let's look at the next slide. I hope it comes up. There we go. On this slide here is the contract life cycle, and we've seen that contract life cycle in the last webinar. So it really starts with planning the procurement, then going out to market and awarding the contract. So those first three steps is what we call the sourcing or the procurement process. It typically takes 6 to 9 months to step through it, and as I said before, it's typically facilitated by procurement. And the goal of these steps are to have a signed contract. We'll then, in the remainder of the webinar, talk about the implement, the manage, the review, and the decide on closeout stages, which I would summarize as being the contract management steps. So these are the sourcing steps, but there's a lot of things that you can do straight up in the beginning of those three parts that will make the management of the resulting contract much easier for you. And let me go through these. So it really starts at that planning of the procurement stage. And key here is to understand what the business really needs. And there is quite often a disconnect between wants and needs, and I want to go into that a bit in more detail. So when you talk about wants and needs, when you talk to your stakeholders within your organization about what they want, there could quite often be something different from what they actually need. And this is a way to discern it. So when you talk to people in the business, they would often describe to you that Ferrari that's at the top right-hand corner there. They would talk about the nice-to-haves and wouldn't then also break it down, okay, what are some desirable aspects and what are absolute must-have aspects of that service? Obviously, you would appreciate that if you buy a Ferrari, that comes with certain with a certain price tag, and it probably also comes with quite a different service delivery as opposed to if you just buy a must-have, which in this case would be I just need a passenger car, right? So really talking to several stakeholders, triangulating between them, what are nice-to-haves, what are must-haves, and what are desirables, will help you getting that planning the procurement stage right. If you tender for a truck, then, if a service provider tenders a truck, well, they can never be successful in this contract, right? So again, if you get this wrong at this stage, you can never have a successful contract because they actually delivered the wrong thing to you. But in order for them to deliver the right thing to you, you actually have to be able to communicate that to them. So then that is what we do in the specifications. So good specifications actually discern between what are the absolute must-haves, what are the desirables, and what are the nice-to-haves. And with the nice-to-haves, you can still put them in your contract, but what you would do is you put them as an optional component of the contract, so you don't pay for them unless you actually have a demand for them throughout the life of the contract. So sometimes it might be required to have a Ferrari. That's great. You can easily roll it into the contract because you already have, say, a schedule of rates in your contract that allows you to roll it in. But you're not paying for those nice-to-haves on a day-to-day basis because they're just an option. By the way, if you do have any further questions, just use that little bar, that little box in your GoToWebinar bar, and I'm happy to take them at any time. So that's now we have an understanding of what your business really needs. In order to get there, you'd have talked to a lot of stakeholders, and you try to involve also the people that will work day to day on managing the contract and work with the service provider to get the performance that you actually need. That's great. What we then also need to do is to understand if the market can actually deliver that. So what is the actual market capability? And when we talk about procurement, it's often around market research. So having at this very early stage a good understanding of what is it that the market typically provides and what is the capacity in the market and the capability in the market to deliver these services is absolutely crucial. You might find that when you talk to your internal stakeholders that they would put together quite disparate sort of services to bundle as one contract. And if that is the case, you might already take out quite a lot of capable service providers that just don't have the breadth of different services that they could reasonably be delivering. So in the case, for example, of facilities management, of facilities maintenance, say you would tender for a contract that has cleaning services and waste management services as a bundle, and that's how you go to market. That's what you put in your specifications. Well, through your market research, you might actually find out that those are, while you might see them as services that are very compatible, the market actually doesn't see them as the same services, and there might be quite some specialized cleaning companies and quite some specialized waste management service providers that if you lumped them together under the one contract, they wouldn't be able to deliver the services as a whole. But if you take the services apart into two distinct contracts, then you actually get a better result from your market engagement. So really at that planning stage, it's all about understanding what is the need and how does that match with the market capabilities. At the next stage, it's about the go-to-market. So, this is often about getting quotes in, and it's often about getting a tender response in. And also about writing up and communicating to the market what your expectations are. And this is often done in the specifications or the statements of works or scope of works. And I talked before about it's important that those are written in a way that you focus on the outcomes rather than the inputs. Let me give you an example of what that means. Imagine you have an issue with your toilets, right? And they're clogged. And you get a plumber in to fix it. The plumber shows up in the morning and you tell them, look, this is my toilet. I need you to do 1, 2, and 3. And I'll come back in half an hour and hopefully you have fixed it. Then in half an hour, the plumber tells you, well, I've done 1, 2, and 3 as you told me. Unfortunately, the toilet's still clogged. The bathroom is also flooded now, but here's my bill. Right? So what you had done is you specified the inputs. Unfortunately, none of what you have specified was able to solve the problem, but because the service provider has done as you told them, they have a right to be paid. On the other hand, had you formulated just the outcome that you were looking for, only when that outcome is achieved, the service provider will actually get paid for it. So outcome-based specification would have been the plumber showed up and you told them, this is my toilet, it's obviously clogged, fix it, then they can only give you the invoice once they have achieved that outcome for you. Especially if you have technology contracts, and IT is obviously one of those, outcome-based specifications also help you get more innovation into your contract. So think about those 3 things that we just specified. If you tell them exactly what to do, well, that might be the way that you could achieve the outcome today, but probably not in 3 years' time. So on the other hand, if you use outcome-based specifications, they always have to use the most appropriate way at the time to achieve those outcomes. So when you specify the inputs, you sort of assume that you would know over the life of the contract how to best achieve those outcomes. Well, first of all, that might change, as I said. Second of all, the service provider might actually have a better knowledge of how to achieve those outcomes than you do. So specifying the inputs sort of assumes that you know exactly how to achieve the outcome. Well, in the case of the plumber, it was just you didn't, right? So the service providers, they have a lot of experience across a lot of clients, and they would typically know how to achieve the outcomes better. So you, through outcome-based specifications, let them bring to the table what they can, and ultimately you get more out of them this way. Then number 4 and 5 on this slide is around developing a suitable performance management framework and also including how you want to manage the contract. We'll talk about these things in later stages of the webinar. At this part, it's just very important that your contract includes a section of how performance will be managed and how you want to manage the contract going forward. If you want to have monthly performance reports and monthly performance meetings, they need to be in the contract. Again, if you have KPIs in the contract, there need to be consequences within the contract and within the pricing structure, because otherwise you spend all of your time measuring KPIs, but actually not getting better behaviors and better outcomes from the service provider. Now, Jade, I believe there's another question. Is that right? Do I understand that right?
Yes, that's correct. Another one from Jake. There is a fear outcome-based specifications lead to higher tender prices. Is there any merit in this?
Right. Look, I haven't seen that. It's an interesting point that I hadn't thought about. Ultimately, I can say outcome-based specifications lead to better outcomes, and they probably give the service provider more incentive to bring something to the table that they might already have. They're probably more risky for the service provider, and that could probably be an argument why the prices would be higher. So the risk obviously being that you at some point disagree of how the outcome can be achieved. whereas input-based specifications would be more in the control of the service provider to actually be able to tell you, well, I've ticked all of these boxes and therefore here's my bill. So probably they would price in that risk, and that could ultimately lead to higher tender prices. I'm a big fan of actually making decisions in procurement based on value for money. So I would say the higher value should by far outweigh the higher cost. Hopefully.
We've received a comment to that last question, Stefan, from another attendee saying, right, in response to that last question, I've seen higher tender prices but lower variations during the contract performance.
That is. Thank you very much for that comment, because obviously, while we might think at this stage, at awarding the contract that we get to in just a moment, we make a value for money decision and just based on the price that was tendered. Well, actually, what we need to look at is the price or the cost over the whole life of the contract, and variations obviously play a big part here. So if your inputs that you have specified in your specifications are not fit for purpose and don't get to the outcomes that you need, you'd have to vary the contract, which in turn then increases the price. So in the end, you might still end up with the same sort of cost anyway, or probably even higher. So thank you for that comment. That's a very good point. Right. So eventually you get to the point where you have now gotten all the proposals in, all the tender responses in, and you need to evaluate them. Now at this part, it's very important to choose suitable evaluation criteria. What are suitable evaluation criteria? Well, they are ones that tie in with what your overall objective of the contract is. And we've unfortunately seen quite a bit that when you have several evaluation criteria, you would weight them. And quite often our clients would weight price really highly. And Jade, I think that is quite a good point to now ask the poll question around how heavily weighted the price is in your sort of contracts. So the question that I would like you to answer is, how high do you normally weight price within your evaluation criteria? And the first one would be it's completely unweighted. The other one is it's below 20%, between 20 and 50%, or higher than 50%.
So 14% of yous typically don't weigh the price criteria. 43% weighed at 0 to 20%, and then 30% of you are between 21 and 50%, and then the remaining of you at 14% are weighed at over 50%.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you very much. So we've actually seen as soon as you weight one of the criteria more than 20%, that's the only criterion that will make the difference between the winning tender and all of the others. So you can have all of these technical evaluation criteria. If you weight price at more than 20%, the cheapest tender will win. That's what we consistently see across all of our of the tenders that have a price weight of more than 20%. So we've gone away from that, and we agree with the 14% of you that have gone through an unweighted assessment of price. So actually not assigning any weight to the pricing criterion, just evaluating the technical the technical responses. And then once they have come in, we rank them, and we also rank the pricing responses, and then we make a true assessment of value for money against, if we need another, say, 10% of technical score, how much money would we have to pay for it? And that ultimately is the definition of value for money for us. So that's why we have gone away from choosing to weight price in the evaluation criteria. Another good experience that we had more recently was around using cultural fit as an evaluation criterion. Cultural fit is a great predictor of how the service provider will work with you to solve problems throughout the life of the contract. And it's, I get normally a bit of pushback when I say that you should have cultural fit as an evaluation criterion, because it sounds so subjective and very difficult to evaluate. Well, look, it doesn't have to be. What you can put in is two questions. The one is, where do you see our organization struggle in this contract over the next 5 years? And then the second question is, and how have you addressed those sort of struggles with other clients? And that really gives you an understanding of how the service provider has thought about your organization and how they will deliver the services for you. Good responses then have 2 pages written about these 2 questions, and bad responses 2 paragraphs, right? So it quickly becomes a quite objective way of seeing and evaluating responses based on the relationship that you can expect throughout the life of the contract. That cultural fit is also great to be assessed during tender interviews and referee checks. So tender interviews are ultimately really important for a successful contract management. You will eyeball the people that are actually delivering the services on the ground, so make sure that it's not just business development people attending those tender interviews, but actually your counterpart, the account manager or the contract manager of the service provider, to be in those tender interviews and ask them some of those questions, such as, you know, what do you think we will struggle with, and how have you solved those problems before? And very similar in referee checks, make sure you actually do referee checks. I know that a lot of people think they're just a waste of time, because what tender is going to put a bad referee forward? Well, you know, I've done a couple of referee checks where I was told, don't ever go near that service provider. And that is the best referee check that you can obviously ever have, because you just dodged a bullet. If you have done 100 referee checks over your career, that's fine. And if 99 of them ever turned out only positive, that's great. But it was worthwhile doing all the 100 because of the one that said, well, please don't. I wouldn't recontract with this service provider. Right. That's what you can do at the sourcing stage. Keep those sort of 7 things in mind, and make sure that your sourcing people and your procurement people are aware of all of those and demand them to be included in your contract, especially when it comes to the performance management framework, because that ultimately will give you better outcomes of your contract. All right, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have at this stage. Jade, have we gotten any additional ones?
We've got a comment just in relation to the last slide, that government regulations does not allow tender interviews.
Right, okay. Well, now I don't know what government that is, but I know that all of the government clients I have run procurements for have actually had tender interviews in them. So tender interview I understand as being a clarification session. So the evaluation has already basically taken part of the written responses, and then you get them in and ask them additional questions about their response. Quite often we might only do that with shortlisted tenderers. So if you've received 20, you're obviously not going to do 20 interviews, but definitely say the top 3. We also make sure that we ask those top 3 the same questions. So we would give them questions on notice. And if we do give any additional information to one tenderer, we take minutes of that tender interview to make sure that we give the same information to all of the other interviewees as well. So that is certainly a way that you can approach it, and I've done it in government. So I don't know what government that is that you had that experience with, but certainly in New South Wales and in the federal government, and also in Victoria and Queensland, that's something that we've done consistently. Any other questions?
Oh, just in response to the tender interview question, Western Australia and local regulation, as in local government, was being referred to.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, unfortunately, I'm not too familiar with WA procurement regulations, so I'm sorry, I can't comment on that. Yeah. I've seen
Any other questions?
there is some more actually here in this box. So one of them is cultural fit is a critical metric. Without it, is a collective realization of the organization's vision is hindered. So without cultural fit, the collective realization of the vision is hindered. Yeah, so that's probably a comment, and I would probably say I would definitely agree with that. It is a critical metric, and it probably just goes to show that it's very important to then also have that as an evaluation criterion and communicate it in your tender, in your request for tender or in your request for quote to the service provider straight away that that is something that you're very interested in, and therefore you have elevated it to an evaluation criterion, and use it to see who's the most suitable provider for you. Sorry, there was another one that was posted.
There's another comment.
Yeah.
In relation to the weighting of price,
Yeah.
I try and avoid weighting price and instead measure value for money by scoring all the qualitative responses and dividing the tendered price by the qualitative score to get $1 per point.
Right. Yep. So that is probably the definition of value for money, right? So that is certainly a good way to go about it. Yes. Yep. Thank you for sharing that.
We've had another question. How do you go about consistently measuring cultural fit?
Consistently measuring it. So that is, I'm not quite sure what consistent between what. So probably consistent between tenders within for one contract. How do you make sure that it's consistent? How you assess each one of those responses that you get? Well, that can obviously be done in the way that you phrase the questions, and making sure that everyone responds to those questions. And the other thing is then if you have you need consistency between contracts, probably, so between different tenders for different things. Well, again, I don't know how much consistency there needs to be. You probably would ask, again, very similar questions against all of the contracts, and just make sure that when they tell you about the cultural fit that they make it contract specific. So I don't think there needs to be a lot of consistency across different contracts. Okay, we just got a clarification from that person asking that. Consistent, particularly in the view of tender evaluation panel members. Okay, right. Okay, right. Obviously, when you have, say, 5 people evaluating tenders, how do you make sure that they all understand the cultural fit in the same way? And that is certainly where consistency needs to come in. What we do is we have the different panel members evaluate all criteria for all of the responses. Then we get together in a workshop and we talk through the scores that everyone has given individually and all of the rationale why they have given a certain score. And through talking through that, we actually ensure that there is quite a consistency. So everyone has to agree to a final score and to a final rationale. And through that workshop and talking through the different issues that you have taken into consideration when scoring that cultural fit, that actually helps normalizing it. And that makes it, again, very objective and rather than subjective. So that's probably how you could ensure consistency across the panel members. All right. Is there
there's another one. Early contractor engagement. Any comments from you? Is it now to be seen? Is it to be seen as being biased in nature while developing specifications?
Okay, earlier contract engagement, that probably would fall in the planning of the procurement stage, so right up at the beginning. It's especially good for complex contracts where you don't know a whole lot about the market itself. So remember how we talked about the market capability and capacity? So if you're unsure about the capability or the capacity, then that is a really good way to go about it. So again, in those instances, what you can do is you could run an expression of interest procurement before you actually go into a tender process. So all you do is you just ask prospective suppliers certain questions, and you don't use those to shortlist them. All you do is you ask for information. You could also do that in a way that you invite prospective tenderers to an industry forum, and you get information from them. That is obviously always a bit critical when it comes to probity in government. So, but it's still encouraged in government as well. It just needs to be clear that everyone attending the industry briefing knows that all you're looking for is information rather than shortlisting, and that it is actually not a procurement per se, that it's just gathering information at that stage, and that normally gets you over the probity line as well. How can you then make sure that that doesn't lead to a bias when developing specifications? Well, that's really up to you, right? So not specifying, for example, that a certain brand is required in your specifications, but keeping it generic, that should help. Ultimately, early industry engagement makes for better specifications, and that is typically appreciated by the market as well as any internal stakeholders. So I think it's really good practice to go about to do early contractor engagement. All right, Jade, I think that's all we really had time for today. I hope that answered all of the questions. Did you want to do the wrap up then?
Yes. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you to everyone for attending our second webinar of the contract management series. If you have any other questions, please email Stefan or I. As you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we'd appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. In the next 1 to 2 days, you'll receive an email with a link to view the recording, and you'll also get the slides from today. The third webinar is on the topic of getting started with managing a contract, and that will be held at the same time, 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday, the 1st of June. If you joined as a trial attendee today and would like to complete the rest of the course, you may purchase an all-access pass from our contract management webinar page on our website. The address is there, but we'll also provide it in the follow-up emails as well. An all-access pass gets you access to the rest of the webinar sessions, the 5 remaining sessions, the contract management course book, all slides and other resources that will release throughout the course, plus a certificate of attendance upon completion. So thank you again on behalf of Grosvenor and our presenter. We hope to see you at the next webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.